There's a very distinct psychological imprint as a result of young boys going off to boarding school. They basically said, you were institutionalized.
Right.
I see these ghostly apparitions. It took me a second to recognize that it was Nick, but he was covered head to toe in talcum powder.
Oh, man.
It's not too late to take responsibility.
Yeah. Hello, I am Tony Cooper, host of the Dad Manual podcast, and I am here today with one of my favorite dads, Stephen. Will you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Stephen Fielding. I'm a great dad, and I have some wisdom to impart.
Yes, you do. You have a lot of wisdom. That is one thing. If I were describing you, I would say watch out for the wisdom, because every time I interact with you, like you're such a considerer of life. I know you're somebody who's done a lot of work throughout your life in personal growth and development. And you and I both know there are lots of courses in the world. There are lots of workshops, but being a father is the greatest environment to be able to develop that tool set of personal growth. So I'm really excited about our conversation. And why don't you just start off by talking about your kids?
Sure. I have two sons, Nick and Max. Nick is the older of the two. He's 18 now. Max is 16. And it's been a wild journey. It's been pretty amazing. And they're growing up into young men that I'm proud of, and I have high hopes that they will continue to evolve positively and make a contribution to society. So that's going to be a good thing to witness and help them along their way as well.
Yeah, actually, ordinarily I like to kind of go back to the beginning and hear about your childhood and stuff. But 16 and 18, they are, other than their brains, for all intents and purposes, they're men. I mean, they look like men. Obviously, they're going to keep developing. So, having that opportunity, and you're somebody who's done a lot of work, men's work as well. So I'm just curious, that last third of childhood, that when the teenage years begin up until about 21, where some people would say your brain's fully developed, it's this whole emergence of identity in the world and who they are and who they're becoming. And it's the time of fathering where you're really stepping back because, you don't want to be battling them. You want to be supporting them to battle the world. So what's it been like in the past few years and seeing that development, like from the beginning of stepping into manhood? I'm curious what you're noticing.
Well, it's understanding where you ideally want them to go, and you imagine the men that they will become, and not succumbing to one's own frustration that they're not there yet. Right. So it develops that muscle of patience, but then also presence and staying engaged with them in terms of their development process. And I wish I was having more time with them to do adventures, and putting them in situations which call for, them to find their own resources and imaginations and that kind of thing. We used to do a lot of camping during scouting, and we would do some hikes and whatnot, but, now they've got their own, group of friends. They are fairly distracted with, at least Nicholas has got a girlfriend and he's got his crew of friends on motorcycles. And, I'm kind of ruining the day that I maybe introduced him to my motorcycle, and he's like, well, you did set the standard. I'm like, oh, I know, so I'm having to live with that. It's a lot of tension to deal with in terms of allowing enough permission for them to get into just enough trouble to be able to understand where their boundary is, but not harm themselves. So a lot of trusting that you've given them enough knowledge to make good decisions in the moment, and they're not going to put themselves in detrimental harm, but exciting harm that they can learn from,
Yeah, that is a fine line for sure, correct. Especially as, adventurous teenage boys, young adults. You and I both know you can get yourself into a lot of trouble. You and I each got ourselves into a lot of trouble in that time, and, thank God survived. And then you're like, God, I just do better than I did. Make better choices.
No. That's right.
You were saying before about, seeing them stepping into becoming the men that you would hope they would step into. Were you clear on what your intentions were for that, for just you with yourself in terms of the kind of men that you want them to grow into? And was that a conversation you shared with them?
The conversation's ongoing. There's a reminder in terms of the qualities that I want them to continue to cultivate. And a lot of them it goes back to meeting them on their first day. And I have always generally followed my instinct in terms of what's needed in the moment, or just have allowed my love to flow into them in terms of my presence, my want to be around them. And when they were obviously infants, I feel like I took a pretty active role in caring for them.
Yeah.
Pretty hands-on, changing diapers, swaddling, feeding in the middle of the night, all the things.
Mm.
The more hands-on and present one is, at least in my experience, the outcomes are paying off now, because I feel like they want to come around and hang with me. They don't leave the house without giving me a hug.
Yeah.
They give me a hug on the way in. That's how I'm a hugger.
You're a pretty huggable dude, I'll tell you that much.
So, yeah, I'm pretty affectionate and generous, that from the heart. So that's where I want them to be aware of the world out there, not to be so tunnel visioned and self-centered, to understand that there's a bigger experience out there to make note of, and to go participate in various different ways wherever their interest draws. But these days a lot of folks find their kids stuck behind the small screen, kind of addicted to dopamine drips and that kind of thing. So that is the chemistry that's going on as a result of being attached to these devices. But it's a challenge.
Yeah, the grand fucking social experiment that we're just willingly like running our entire generation of children through. Just say, hey, let's see how this turns out.
Yeah. It's a little daunting.
Yeah.
So I think, rather than have a lot of consternation and worry about the broader world, then I just bring it right back to, well, how's my household running? And I would say we've made mistakes. We've used devices as babysitters. We've, used devices as a way to put them in front of educational material. COVID was not for the faint of heart in terms of, remote study, and, it was all devices all the time. So I think there's more to be done. I have, Max is the younger of the two, and I still have a little runway with him to take him out and to do hikes and go for a summer adventure together. Nick is kind of, beginning to fly the coop a little bit more regularly. So it's harder to get time on his schedule.
I want to go out on a limb and guess that you were not raised in a very huggy environment.
No. Yes and no.
Okay.
At home, my mom was very affectionate, and she was very attentive to how happy the kids were, and made sure that we had everything squared away. And my dad was now a retired physician. He was a surgeon. So when I was little, he was a registrar, and a resident, learning the skills of a surgeon. So he was not at home, and it was an infrequent thing to have him present in the home. So I can probably remember during the course of my schooling, elementary, high school, college, that he probably came to a half a dozen sporting events. I mean, I played rugby, wrestled in high school. That was all he could
like you can almost count it on one hand.
Yeah. But that's not to say that it's the very common story of that generation. He was born in 1940, and the wartime in London, and he grew up in London. So that generation was pretty stoic in terms of their attention to the kids, and being British as well. And the non-huggy part of it is going off to British boarding school. So
how old were you?
10.
So you were 10 when you went to boarding school. So that was, and it was funny, I was just trying to do the math. So Max was about 10 when COVID hit. Is that right? Okay. So what was that like for you? The idea, it still doesn't make sense in my head. There's no fucking way would I have sent my kids away from me prior to like when they go to college, when they just go away from you when they're supposed to. To me, that's such a powerful period of time to not be around your kids. So was that just a normal thing, or what was that experience like for you?
Somewhat normal. I mean, in society, in British society, I was the firstborn of 3 kids, the only son in the family, right? So firstborn son, it is not uncommon for you to get private education and get on the conveyor belt from a preparatory school to go to public school. And public schools are the high schools, the high level high schools.
Yeah.
So public school over there is Harrow, Eton, Epsom, those kinds of institutions. And then you would go on to Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, those high level universities.
So that's like the conveyor belt, like that. You get started back here and you wind up at Oxford.
And so you would meet or become all your business contacts, your social contacts. You get, plugged into the social society calendar, and you'd go to all the events and yada, yada, yada. So, and I wasn't the youngest kid at the boarding school. There were kids that were sent there, 7 and 8.
Wow.
And they're international kids. So these are folks who have means that want to get a British boarding school education, and they start early. So one of the kids in my class was the son of an ambassador to Nigeria. So a wide selection of different backgrounds.
Societally, it was not an abnormal thing that would happen. In fact, amongst a certain population, that was kind of expected what would happen. But what was the experience like? I mean, you're a 10-year-old boy.
Obviously, we had uniforms, and the headmaster, Mr. Davies, other than my 2 grandfathers and my father, he's the most influential male person and input into my life. And we were talking before about how there's this sort of mental construct, this character that I have in my personality that can be attributed to a lot of the characteristics are the headmaster. So being on time, being rigid about expectations, meeting goals, being turned out and, presented well in terms of wearing your tie and your shoes are polished. And he was a British Army captain.
Okay.
He would come around on Thursday evenings and make sure all our shoes are polished, ready for Sunday church. We'd be marching up 2 by 2 up to Harrow, to the chapel up in Harrow for service. And the usual tropes around, the potential of corporal punishment was present. Being away from one's family home.
Right.
Was just, and I only lived 30 minutes away,
Okay.
And so to be that close and that far away at the same time was a real challenge for me personally.
Yeah. Just
in the past few years, Sunday evenings, which is when if I went home over the weekend, Sunday evenings, even doing laundry on a Sunday night, a Sunday afternoon, brings up certain, like, I notice my stomach churning, a homesick feeling, like an anticipation of not being where I want to be.
Yeah.
So saying goodbye to friends and at the end of the weekend, if we have a gathering, it brings up even today, and I'm in my late 50s. So
I just imagine had to be an incredible amount of homesickness, and it's not the right time to leave your family. Your family, like you're just becoming yourself.
Yeah.
And to leave your family is it just feels like this big psychological chasm that gets created.
Yeah. So that's exactly what happens. And then you layer on top of that, the requisite bullying. And I was the recipient of a fair amount of it.
Yeah.
Funny story. Years later, I was sifting through my educational files that my dad had kept, and there was a letter from the headmaster. In the last term of my 4th year there, my nemesis and I got into a fisticuff in the bathroom, and he had poured water on me before I was getting up. And I was like, to hell with this. And I had gotten a 5-gallon bucket, filled it half up, doused him, and then we got into a fisticuff. And he wrote a letter to my dad saying, "I'm very happy to report that Stephen sort of stood up to this guy, and they threw blows, and we took care of it, and all's better." So,
man, that's a big moment for you. Like, one of these, like the bullying been going on for a long time. You finally said, "Enough is enough."
Enough's enough, yeah. And there was a lesson to me in terms of not to let things go for so long, to take action. And that's part of some of the coaching I've been giving my boys, which is they're not subject to bullying, but don't just absorb stuff the whole time. If it doesn't feel like, tackle the issue right then and there.
Yeah.
And then, like I said before, in the past year or so, I discovered a book which talks about this thing that psychologists are now naming boarding school syndrome.
Boarding school syndrome. Okay.
And I'm like, holy cow, what? And I looked at the review of the book and read the back cover and a few pages. And there's this whole thing where there's a very distinct psychological imprint as a result of young boys going off to boarding school. And they basically said, you were institutionalized.
Right.
And so when I'm trying to grok this, I was institutionalized. No, that was a privilege. I'm trying
Right.
to, it's like I was put there because, I had some path to follow, that I was, following a privileged,
Hmm.
I had this opportunity, and they were like, no, you suffered as a result of that.
Yeah, I mean that makes total sense to me. And even you were saying before, I mean, like we're here to talk about being a dad, and about 10 is really when, if you haven't been present as a dad, like that's the time. And in that moment, you got pulled away from your dad. I mean, your dad, it sounds like he was doing his best but wasn't very present. And then when you need him the most, the whole family got stripped away. And so I can see how the psyche immediately gravitates toward the headmaster as like a father figure, because we need it as young men. We need to grow toward something, right? Plants grow toward the sun. I think we tend to, as we're stepping into our masculinity, our hormones, our puberty, all the things becoming not a child, but a man, will grow toward a masculine figure. And in most cases, that's a dad. But when you're at a
Mhm.
boarding school, shit, it's your teacher, it's your headmaster, it's somebody.
For sure. And I think, Mr. Davies was the primary imprint, but Orley Farm School was the school I went to, and there were a couple handful of teachers there that, as sort of an amalgam, of boarding school, and the imprint from that experience, rippled until, I don't know, early 50s. And it was then that I started really sort of peeling back the layers, when I decided to separate from Nick and Max's mom, and
Mhm.
the marriage wasn't really meeting expectations. And again, post divorce, there are a couple of resources that I wish I had beforehand, because a lot of what was going on was just my immature self, my younger self, running the show,
Yeah.
wanting affection, wanting attention, wanting these things that I was looking for from my partner, and not taking ownership and responsibility and delivering it for myself.
Is that a consequence of having gone away to boarding school at that time, where just, maybe your emotional self is feeling like that's when that connection stopped, when that emotional response? Because I imagine it's not a very loving environment in a British boarding school.
No, it has more to do with order and meeting expectations and standards.
So is there like an emotional truncation, arrested development of something that happened about that time? Is that what you're pointing toward?
Well, it's interesting that I always wanted to be part of the crew. There was a group of boys that would sometimes accept me, and sometimes I was the low man on the totem pole.
Hmm.
And so it's interesting that I, decades later, 20 years ago now, dove into men's work and really found, that I have a capacity to hold space for men that
Yeah.
are hurting or dealing with shit, that need to work through stuff. I have a depth of compassion and perspective and empathy for them, maybe because that I went through all the shit as a 10-year-old to a
Hmm.
13-year-old,
Right.
and can see their younger self operating their adult body, and just saying, I know that,
Yeah.
there's some, and give them a reflection that sometimes unlocks sort of insights and grace for themselves. So it's interesting that my work in wanting to be one of the brothers, part of the crew, that I take pride in being able to create that kind of space for men to feel
Yeah.
connected together and understand the benefit of brotherhood, and understand the connection between man to man, and that we are not meant to be lone wolves, and we're meant to be, working together cooperatively and collaboratively. And yes, we can have our own distinct, set of standards and what we want to accomplish in the world, our vision for ourselves in life, but we go further and sometimes more effectively together than solo.
Such a good lesson of leadership. Give to the world the thing that I want to receive.
Mhm.
And also, leadership is be willing to go through the pain in order to create the relief for others.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
those are good. So I'm thinking about, so we all form ideas about fatherhood before we become dads. And then becoming a dad like wakes us up to what might be possible. So there's this amalgamation of your father, the headmaster, other teachers and influencers. Was there a strong desire to become a dad? Like, was it inherent in you? Like, I'm definitely going to be that, or did you discover that along the way?
I would say, what I noticed is I definitely knew that I wanted to be in marriage, that construct, right?
Okay.
And to have an exclusive partner that I build a life with. And as part of that commitment, we were going to have a family. Don't
Got
know
it.
when,
Yeah.
but that was part of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
So I would look at it that way. So,
Yeah.
yes. And I knew that I had the capacity to hold that container in terms of fatherhood and be a partner. And because, the one thing my dad was exemplary at was providing. And we
Mm-hmm.
wanted for nothing. And we had a very, comfortable upbringing, did the activities that we wanted to do. And my two sisters, one's now a former professional ballet dancer. So you can imagine the training and
Oh, wow.
commitment to that. And then my other younger sister, she was a great horsewoman. She still is active in show jumping as a hobby. But back as a teenager, she was competitively, just below Olympic level.
Wow.
So doing, East Coast shows and that kind of stuff. So she was pretty highly adept at show jumping
Yeah.
and eventing. So we all got to do our thing, which provides resources and requires resources. So he was very generous in providing that to his family. And that same kind of approach to
Yeah.
family is what I have
Yeah.
too.
So then let's go back to, Nick being born. You remember that moment?
I have preserved that moment in a photograph. As you know, I'm a passionate photographer as a hobby. I used to be a wedding photographer for a minute. I don't know what camera it was, but I captured his first breath.
Mm.
He was a C-section. He was breech, so he had to be delivered by C-section.
Yeah.
But you can, in the picture, at least to me, you can see him with that inhale, and then he's just about to scream and cry. And yeah, I mean, it's just a beautiful moment that you kind of feel like I didn't get the full effect of awestruck, but seeing another, a woman being my wife, being the portal for him coming into the world, and it's just a beautiful moment.
How did all that impact you? I love that, it's 18 years ago and you just instantly emotionally connect to that moment.
Yeah.
Like it changes everything.
It does. It's when one looks back at life, there are, likely just a handful, maybe a dozen or two moments that that was a moment that changed your trajectory of your life. The birth of children are that, and your firstborn is that much more special. Sorry, Max.
The second born knows.
There's all sorts of funny things about the worries that you have about caring for your first child, but by the time you get to your third one, you're like, he'll be all right. So,
Right. Because you know what the fuck you're doing. Like, I
yeah.
mean, there's that intersection of like the magical nature of like, oh my God, 2 becomes 3. There's
Yeah.
something about like even pregnancy that we know there's a child in there, but you're still a couple. And then the moment a child is born, you're 50% bigger as a family and your attention completely shifts in the moment as to what's important. And you don't know what you're doing. Like that's
Yeah.
it always hit me like, wow, I rarely dive into things without having a fucking clue about what I'm doing. And
Right.
that moment. So what was present for you in that emotion when you connected to that?
There's like a holy shit, now I'm responsible, for another human, and
Yeah.
they're looking to me, and my wife's looking to me to care for, the family unit. So there's that new added layer of responsibility, a sense of pride, and definitely some awe in terms of, partner, wife, has delivered another human into the world. And, there's a lot of gratitude because it immediately unlocks this, new level of seemingly bottomless repository of love
Yeah.
for this new infant that you'd do anything for. So there's an appreciation for that. And then there's, for me, all these instincts that started to like come online. You do start to understand the different qualities of crying that the baby has. Oh, he has gas, or oh, he's hungry, or oh, he's just tired, or oh, he wants to be held, or you can interpret what their needs are in the moment. I found that quite amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the resources that I just swear by, there was a video called Happiest Baby on the Block.
Okay.
And it was all about how to swaddle the infant and then cradle them and shush them, and very close to their ear. And it would recreate sort of womb-like environment, and it would settle them right down. So if there's anything like, go pay attention to this video, get Happiest Baby on the Block, any new fathers, and you'll be in good hands. The infant will be in good hands.
I remember the nurses at the hospital teaching us the swaddling, and you're like, I mean, you're literally wrapping it up like a burrito. Like, that's too tight. There's no way that's the right thing to do. And they're like, trust us. I'm like,
Yeah.
I do trust you. Yeah.
Yeah, became an expert at that. That's a very useful skill.
Yeah.
You will be doing hundreds and maybe thousands of swaddling moments.
When you said that bottomless well of love, it really is. I mean, we all grow up hearing about this idea of unconditional love. And in fact, I don't think that there's anything but unconditional love. But the problem is we've all been exposed to it with limitations and conditions and all those things. And then this thing arrives, and it's a thing. It's literally a thing at that point. And when you just describe like this bottomless feeling of love, it's like, it really is, for most people, the first time you have a like, oh shit, like that's what unconditional love feels like. Like absolutely love, like, like Christians will call like grace, like the always there love from God that you didn't do anything to deserve, you can't do anything to lose, like absolute pure adoration and love that has no limit. That's a moment, man, because it changes your entire life and your entire relationship with everybody because now that's possible.
Yeah, it definitely does. It adds a layer of responsibility. Like I said, as a dad, hey, here's my boy. There's some pride around that. There's some sense of accomplishment in terms of your handling your business, in terms of this new life construct that you've helped co-create. And it demands to figure out how you're going to do right by your partner as well. There's this part. I feel like I could have done better. I didn't necessarily achieve the outcome that I wanted. I wanted what my parents had. They were married for 50 years plus, 56 years. And we didn't quite make it. So
did having a child change something? Like what shifted in your relationship?
There's the younger self that wanted things. And and I would say he's about 11. And if you look at it, we talked about internal family systems, Richard Schwartz. There are versions of ourself that make up our personality and our psyche. They're running the show to varying degrees at varying times.
Right.
And my frustration and want and desire to have affection and have attention, came from that needy place of a young self. And, that's the other thing, is that, I've come to better understanding around, is that in relationship, one really needs to take ownership for and understand your capacity for leadership in relationship. As men, we hold the container. We have lots of conversation around masculine and feminine these days.
Yeah.
And what is the feminine, and how does the like an integrated, mature masculine energy show up? And my perspective these days is that you're in tune with what you notice, and you own what's in you, and you stop projecting it on other folks around you, and that you communicate your needs in such a way that it's not needy, but it's what would feel good in this moment, and see whether your partner can provide or offer that to you in return. And if not, when would that work for you? That kind of dialogue, if you go back to the principles around nonviolent communication, that's a good book to peruse and sort of learn some of the constructs. Another good one is The Collaborative Way. So that was a useful construct to have. And these are all tools that I became aware of post-separation, as well as insights around my own patterning. Critical book was Robert Glover and his book, No More Mr. Nice Guy. And I was just nodding through that. I'm like, holy cow, I made so many mistakes.
Yeah. What stands out is the errors of your ways.
Well, there was a request. What I was presented with from Nick and Max's mom was that she wanted to find herself. She wanted a better understanding of herself, and could I give her space to do that?
How old were the kids at this point?
This was 2018, so like eight and 10 ish.
Right.
Max were at 8, and Nick was about 10.
Yep.
Or 9 and 11. So yeah, my patience had run out because we had been dealing with a whole bunch of other things. We'd been in therapy. We'd been doing the things, and it felt like I'd spent, and it was pretty much from when Nick was gestating, basically in utero. He was the situation is placenta previa, so the doctor's advice was minimize the amount of sex you're having, and that just truncated the amount of one-on-one time that we had.
Yeah.
Which was the kind of, for me, that was the beginning of the end.
Right.
And then once Max came along, then we had a responsibility of 2 kids. And then I had job changes. I had a lot of pressure from work. I had panic attacks a couple of times. So there's a whole bunch of things that we haven't talked about in terms of, how you show up for work and how you show up for your family, and how to manage stress and self-care and understand what you need to feel nurtured, but not putting the onus on your partner to deliver that. She's already taking care of the kids and whatnot. She doesn't need another kid to take care of.
Right.
In the same breath, how can you communicate your needs without it feeling like needy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those conversations of like, I'm doing everything around here. What are you doing? Like, and both parties are pointing the finger in the exact same way toward each other. And, one of the observations I've seen where couples, before kids, they face each other, right? They are the only ones that exist. And then when the kid's born, you separate, you go shoulder to shoulder, and your attention is on this child or the children because they need you in a particular kind of way. And by the time you get to be about 6 or 7 years old, is the time you go, okay, well, the police state is over. They're fully functioning on their own. They don't need the same kind of attention. And the couple gets to relax kind of back into that face-to-face relationship again. But you and I both know they've been through a whole life cycle, 7 years. You're not the same person in any way you were 7 years ago. When you look back in each other's eyes, you don't recognize each other. You've gone some different places. And that's the moment that I feel like if parents can go, shit, we need to rediscover each other and create this next phase of our relationship, therapy, whatever it is, do the work. But most people just revert back to like, it was easier when we were just co-parenting, when we're shoulder to shoulder. And it's that moment where I think people essentially give up on the relationship.
Yeah. And there's a natural flow to one's psychological development. There's James Hollis is a great Jungian psychologist, and I've learned a lot through his books. And one of them is called The Middle Passage. And so right about the time that this stuff was starting to come up, if I, again, read that book and had that understanding, like, this is normal. What you can do about it is, pay attention to yourself, go find the things that bring you joy, be curious about what this phase of life feels like to your partner or wife, and get to know them again better in terms of who they are now.
Right.
And find ways to connect through that, not well, we used to do this and I want that again.
Yeah.
Why aren't you delivering that to me? And you suck, basically this sucks. I'm not having a great time here.
Yeah.
Well, that's abdicating, again, responsibility and accountability to, well, how am I bringing my best self to the equation? So,
and the opportunity to celebrate your partner's exploration of that too. Like, you're on yours and celebrating and seeing it as not a path away from each other, but a way to find your way back to each other.
Yeah.
I was wondering about lessons learned and being a dad. Obviously, being a dad changes you quite a bit. Like, moments where you look back and you just feel like, man, I wish I'd handled that differently.
Well, the story I'm going to tell. There's one that comes up to mind, and it's like, oh my God, I really blew that time. Blew it. And I would have such a different response these days. So here's the scenario. So Max was recently born. probably a couple months old. My parents hadn't met him yet. They were out visiting. And so we had done birth time. We'd put the boys to bed, and we were just downstairs chatting with my mom and dad. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see this ghostly apparition sort of past the end of the couch and sort of present itself to me. It took me a second to recognize that it was Nick, but he was covered head to toe in talcum powder.
Oh, man.
And I was like, what did you do? So we went upstairs and we looked in his room, and it was just this plume of talcum powder everywhere and this big pile of talcum powder on his bed. And he'd made a good old mess. And instead of just saying, did you have fun exploring? And
Right.
like, that's really fun, isn't it? Or, just like, oh boy, and having at least a neutral reaction, if not a, oh my God, this is a moment. Let me take a picture and,
Yeah,
what were
right.
you doing? Show me what you were doing to get it this way. Let's do some
Yeah.
more,
Yeah.
And then clearing up. It was the headmaster kicked in that moment. It was like, what are you doing? We told you not to touch the talcum powder. That's just for, us to use with Max on the changing table. Like, what are you doing? And he started emoting and reacting and got really nervous. And my mom started to chime in and give her 2 cents too. And that really got him upset. And it took about 30, 40 minutes to settle him down, for rock him and sing to him. And he just was, convulsing and weeping on my lap, reacted so much to it. And
what was the experience like for you as you were going through? Because you had a long enough period of time to see the effects of the choice you made. I'm just curious what that 30 minutes was like for you.
I had to tap back into patience in terms of not like going right back at him and saying, get into bed, you made the mess, and now we had to change all your sheets and whatnot, go to sleep.
Yeah.
And walk out of the room. I ended up, like I said, spending the time that was needed to get him back to his. And it's funny because in the past few years, I've become certified in breathwork, somatic breathwork, and I've been diving into polyvagal theory and nervous system regulation and whatnot. And I totally see what was going on with his nervous system, and to get back into that co-regulation, because I spent so many evenings with him literally on my shoulder rocking. And, there were a couple songs. There was Billy Joel's Lullaby. If you ever listened to that song, imagine sitting in those rocking chairs with that playing and singing along with a song with him, and he was out like a light. Or going back to my rugby days, the England rugby team's song is Swing Low, Sweet Chariot.
Okay, yeah.
So I know that most of the verses to that. So I'm singing that, hymn to him, or singing along to Lullaby by Billy Joel.
Yeah.
And those usually calm down his nervous system. And it brought up another memory. Years later, when he was about 13, 14, I started singing. I said, do you remember this song? And I started singing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot.
Yeah.
He goes, not exactly, but it feels very comforting. So I'm like, okay, yeah. I said, you've heard that I don't know how many dozens of times, during bedtime routine. So
right. The nervous system knows.
The body remembers, the body keeps the score.
Yeah. So kind of a big traumatic experience for Nick and for you. So what decision did you make in that moment? Who did you become after that? Like, how did that impact you?
Tell you the truth, I don't think I changed. I didn't have a conscious choice or a conscious shift. It was kind of years later. I'm like, oh, I could have done better with that.
Right.
I think in his early teens, I said, do you remember, the talcum powder? And he goes, yeah, I think I remember. I said, I'm so sorry. It's not too late to take responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's another, little tip to fathers is that if you recognize something that you're like, oh shit, I could have done better.
Never too late to clean it up.
It's never too late to communicate and unburden that soul from that experience and put it to neutral.
Yeah, especially when you talk about it from a nervous system regulation perspective. Like, the brain may not have a conscious memory of it, but there's this subconscious and the nervous system will remember, and for you to acknowledge that feels really healing and powerful. Yeah. And I think, if there was anything in the way of your relationship, that's a great way to remove it, so that you can have that deeper connection.
Yeah. And I go back to the memory of my dad. We were doing some yard work or whatever, and I was probably about 16. After a couple of years of living in the States, I moved over when I was 14 from England. And as guys are apt to do when they're doing stuff together, they talk about shit and talk things through. And he said, "Yeah, just know that I think I made a mistake leaving you in England for that year." And he apologized for that decision making. And he said, when you have a family, just remember to always keep the family together. So there was that, which made separating from their mom even more difficult because I was always committed to, and that's why I stayed so long.
Yeah.
Is always keep the family together.
Right.
It's kind of a double-edged sword when you feel like you want to make good on your dad's like advice to you, but then it kind of comes at a cost sometimes.
Yeah. It's never as easy as it sounds.
Right. Yeah.
Why don't we conclude with thinking about being a first-time dad? Because that's really who I'm hoping gets a ton of value out of these conversations, is someone who gets to see the journey in advance rather than figuring it out as you go along. Like back to that early days, first couple of years, what advice would you offer to a brand new father?
So much. I'm trying to whittle it down to like, here are the 3 things you should know.
Yeah.
It's an exercise in getting over yourself. You're literally going to be dealing with shit a lot. A lot of shit's going to come up, and some of it could literally hit the wall or hit the fan on the changing table. So get used to bodily functions, get used to making contribution, expect nothing back. It's a thankless, and never-ending task. But when you invest wholeheartedly and you put your whole self into it, it pays dividends, that you can't imagine down the road. And spend as much time as you can with infants, like right up against, sleeping on your chest, taking them for walks, reading to them, listening to music together, go to the mommy and me play dates. Yes, you're going to be like one of 2 dads there. I had
the best dads, are there.
Yeah. And that was actually one of the things, I was laid off 2 weeks after Max was born. And
shit.
Well, that turned out to be a silver lining. Years later, I had about 2 years of contract work and cobbling together income resources and that kind of thing. But I was mostly a stay-at-home dad. And I wouldn't change it now. Yeah, it was tough to go through and to puzzle together, the mortgage payment and this, that, and the other and whatnot. But the time that I had with the boys for those 2 years, wouldn't change it for the world.
Yeah.
And, make sure you practice some chefing.
Yeah. Right.
Have a few meals that that you have some skills in making.
In your repertoire. Yeah.
In your repertoire. It's time that all the possible things are on the table. You should have a broad skill set. You should know how to change the oil as much as it is to make a meal or change a diaper or just listen to your wife. Don't have to fix anything. And take an interest in how yourself works.
Yeah, that's probably there. That's probably more than anything.
Yeah. Start the interior work early, even before you start having kids. And even back it up. Like make the choice to be a father an intentional one.
Yeah.
So if there's any, listeners who are on the cusp, of starting a family and whatnot, create a list of intentions of how do you want it to be.
Yeah.
And it's up to you to create that container and that framework and lead.
Yeah, because it can easily be the greatest adventure of your lifetime.
Oh, it is. And, like we talked about before, it's never too late to course correct.
Right. Right.
So if you come to the realization and, your kids are teenagers and you're like, I want to do something different. That's great. Let's start doing something different.
Well, Stephen, I just want to thank you for doing all of the work you've done in your life, for being such an attentive dad who treated it really seriously, and for your time and sharing so openly and vulnerably and sharing so much wisdom. I just really appreciate you. I've loved our conversation and just thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's an honor to have the conversation. It's always great to catch up and hope to do it again soon.
Awesome. Well, until next time.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Dad Manual Podcast. If you liked it, please leave us a rating or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you really liked it, please share it with a dad you love. I'm looking to grow a community of fathers who are ready to change the world, and I need your help to do that. And if you got questions or topics you want me to explore, email them to me at thedadmanual@gmail.com. I would love to answer your questions on our next episode. Until next time, I'm Tony Cooper, and this is the Dad Manual Podcast.